8. After this we had a period of stagnation which lasted 9 years. The hysterical outbreaks and sobbings on my shoulder that occurred at regular intervals did not in the least mar our prosperity. I wonder that Stepan Trofimovitch did not grow stout during this period. His nose was a little redder, and his manner had gained in urbanity, that was all. By degrees a circle of friends had formed around him, although it was never a very large one. Though Varvara Petrovna had little to do with the circle, yet we all recognized her as our patroness. After the lessons she had received in Petersburg, she settled down in our town for good. In winter she lived in her town house and spent the summer on her estate in the neighbourhood. She had never enjoyed so much consequence and prestige in our provincial society as during the last 7 years of this period, that is, up to the time of the appointment of our present governor. Our former governor, the mild Ivan Osipovitch, who will never be forgotten among us, was a near relation of Varvara Petrovna's, and had at one time been under obligations to her. His wife trembled at the very thought of displeasing her, while the homage paid her by provincial society was carried almost to a pitch that suggested idolatry. So Stepan Trofimovitch, too, had a good time. He was a member of the club, lost at cards majestically, and was everywhere treated with respect, though many people regarded him only as a learned man. Later on, when Varvara Petrovna allowed him to live in a separate house, we enjoyed greater freedom than before. Twice a week we used to meet at his house. We were a merry party, especially when he was not sparing of the champagne. The wine came from the shop of the same Andreev. The bill was paid twice a year by Varvara Petrovna, and on the day it was paid Stepan Trofimovitch almost invariably suffered from an attack of his summer cholera. One of the first members of our circle was Liputin, an elderly provincial official and a great liberal, who was reputed in the town to be an atheist. He had married for the second time a young and pretty wife with a dowry, and had, besides, 3 grown-up daughters. He brought up his family in the fear of God, and kept a tight hand over them. He was extremely stingy, and out of his salary had bought himself a house and amassed a fortune. He was an uncomfortable sort of man, and had not risen in the service. He was not much respected in the town, and was not received in the best circles. Moreover, he was an open scandalmonger, and had more than once had to smart for his backbiting, for which he had been badly punished by an officer, and again by a country gentleman, the respectable head of a family. But we liked his wit, his inquiring mind, his peculiar, malicious liveliness. Varvara Petrovna disliked him, but he always knew how to make it up to her. Nor did she care for Shatov, who became one of our circle during the last years of this period. Shatov had been a student and had been expelled from the university after some disturbance. In his childhood he had been a student of Stepan Trofimovitch's, and was by birth a serf of Varvara Petrovna's, the son of a former valet of hers, Pavel Fyodoritch, and was greatly indebted to her bounty. She disliked him for his pride and ingratitude, and could never forgive him for not having come straight to her on his expulsion from the university. On the contrary, he had not even answered the letter she had expressly sent him at the time, and preferred to be a drudge in the family of a merchant of the new style with whom he went abroad, looking after his children more in the position of a nurse than of a tutor. He was very eager to travel at the time. The children had a governess too, a lively young Russian lady, who also became one of the household on the eve of their departure, and had been engaged chiefly because she was so cheap. 2 months later the merchant turned her out of the house for free thinking. Shatov took himself off after her, and soon afterwards married her in Geneva. They lived together about 3 weeks, and then parted as free people, recognizing no bonds though, no doubt also through poverty. He wandered about Europe alone for a long time afterwards, living God knows how. He is said to have blacked boots in the streets, and to have been a porter in some dockyard. At last, a year before, he had returned to his native place among us, and settled with an old aunt, whom he buried a month later. His sister Dasha, who had also been brought up by Varvara Petrovna, was a favourite of hers, and treated with respect and consideration in her house. He saw his sister rarely, and was not on intimate terms with her. In our circle he was always sullen and never talkative, But from time to time, when his convictions were touched upon, he became morbidly irritable and very unrestrained in his language. "One has to tie Shatov up and then argue with him," Stepan Trofimovitch would sometimes say in joke. But he liked him. Shatov had radically changed some of his former socialistic convictions abroad, and had rushed to the opposite extreme. He was one of those idealistic beings common in Russia, who are suddenly struck by some overmastering idea which seems, as it were, to crush them at once, and sometimes for ever. They are never equal to coping with it, but put passionate faith in it, and their whole life passes afterwards, as it were, in the last agonies under the weight of the stone that has fallen upon them and half crushed them. In appearance Shatov was in complete harmony with his convictions. He was short, awkward, had a shock of flaxen hair, broad shoulders, thick lips, very thick overhanging white eyebrows, a wrinkled forehead, and a hostile, obstinately downcast, as it were shamefaced, expression in his eyes. His hair was always in a wild tangle, and stood up in a shock which nothing could smooth. He was 27 or 28. "I no longer wonder that his wife ran away from him," Varvara Petrovna enunciated on one occasion, after gazing intently at him. He tried to be neat in his dress, in spite of his extreme poverty. He refrained again from appealing to Varvara Petrovna, and struggled along as best he could, doing various jobs for tradespeople. At one time he served in a shop, at another he was on the point of going as an assistant clerk on a freight steamer, but he fell ill just at the time of sailing. It is hard to imagine what poverty he was capable of enduring without thinking about it at all. After his illness Varvara Petrovna sent him 100 roubles, anonymously and in secret. He found out the secret, however, and after some reflection took the money and went to Varvara Petrovna to thank her. She received him with warmth, but on this occasion too he shamefully disappointed her. He only stayed 5 minutes, staring blankly at the ground and smiling stupidly in profound silence, and suddenly, at the most interesting point, without listening to what she was saying, he got up, made an uncouth sideways bow, helpless with confusion, caught against the lady's expensive inlaid work table, upsetting it on the floor and smashing it to atoms, and walked out nearly dead with shame. Liputin blamed him severely afterwards for having accepted the 100 roubles, and having even gone to thank Varvara Petrovna for them, instead of having returned the money with contempt, because it had come from his former despotic mistress. He lived in solitude on the outskirts of the town, and did not like any of us to go and see him. He used to turn up invariably at Stepan Trofimovitch's evenings, and borrowed newspapers and books from him. There was another young man who always came, one Virginsky, a clerk in the service here, who had something in common with Shatov, although on the surface he seemed his complete opposite in every respect. He was a family man too. He was a pathetic and very quiet young man, though he was 30. He had considerable education, though he was chiefly self-taught. He was poor, married, and in the service, and supported the aunt and sister of his wife. His wife and all the ladies of his family professed the very latest convictions, but in rather a crude form. It was a case of an idea dragged forth into the street, as Stepan Trofimovitch had expressed it upon a former occasion. They got it all out of books, and at the first hint coming from any of our little progressive corners in Petersburg, they were prepared to throw anything overboard, so soon as they were advised to do so. Madame Virginsky practised as a midwife in the town. She had lived a long while in Petersburg as a girl. Virginsky himself was a man of rare single-heartedness, and I have seldom met more honest fervour. "I will never, never abandon these bright hopes," he used to say to me with shining eyes. Of these bright hopes he always spoke quietly, in a blissful half whisper, as it were secretly. He was rather tall, but extremely thin and narrow shouldered, and had extraordinarily lank hair of a reddish hue. All Stepan Trofimovitch's condescending gibes at some of his opinions he accepted mildly, answered him sometimes very seriously, and often nonplussed him. Stepan Trofimovitch treated him very kindly, and indeed he behaved like a father to all of us. "You are all half-hearted chickens," he observed to Virginsky in joke. All who are like you, though in you, Virginsky, I have not observed that narrow-mindedness I found in Petersburg, chez ces séminaries. But you're a half-hatched chicken all the same. Shatov would give anything to hatch out, but he's half-hatched too." "And I?" Liputin inquired. "You're simply the golden mean, which will get on anywhere in its own way." Liputin was offended. The story was told of Virginsky, and it was unhappily only too true, that before his wife had spent a year in lawful wedlock with him, she announced that he was superseded and that she preferred Lebyadkin. This Lebyadkin, a stranger to the town, turned out afterwards to be a very dubious character, and not a retired captain as he represented himself to be. He could do nothing but twist his moustache, drink, and chatter the most inept nonsense that can possibly be imagined. This fellow, who was utterly lacking in delicacy, at once settled in his house, glad to live at another man's expense, ate and slept there, and came in the end to treating the master of the house with condescension. It was asserted that when Virginsky's wife had announced to him that he was superseded, he said to her, "My dear, hitherto I have only loved you, but now I respect you." But I doubt whether this renunciation, worthy of ancient Rome, was ever really uttered. On the contrary, they say that he wept violently. A fortnight after he was superseded, all of them, in a family party, went one day for a picnic to a wood outside the town to drink tea with their friends. Virginsky was in a feverishly lively mood, and took part in the dances, but suddenly, without any preliminary quarrel, he seized the giant Lebyadkin with both hands by the hair just as the latter was dancing a can-can solo, pushed him down, and began dragging him along with shrieks, shouts, and tears. The giant was so panic-stricken that he did not attempt to defend himself, and hardly uttered a sound all the time he was being dragged along. But afterwards he resented it with all the heat of an honourable man. Virginsky spent a whole night on his knees begging his wife's forgiveness. But this forgiveness was not granted, as he refused to apologize to Lebyadkin. Moreover, he was upbraided for the meanness of his ideas and his foolishness, the latter charge based on the fact that he knelt down in the interview with his wife. The captain soon disappeared and did not reappear in our town till quite lately, when he came with his sister and with entirely different aims. But of him later. It was no wonder that the poor young husband sought our society and found comfort in it. But he never spoke of his home life to us. On one occasion only, returning with me from Stepan Trofimovitch's, he made a remote allusion to his position, but clutching my hand at once, he cried ardently, "It's of no consequence. It's only a personal incident. It's no hindrance to the cause, not the slightest." Stray guests visited our circle too. A Jew called Lyamshin and a Captain Kartusov came. An old gentleman of inquiring mind used to come at one time, but he died. Liputin brought an exiled Polish priest called Slontsevsky, and for a time we received him on principle, but afterwards we didn't keep it up. End of Section 8